Hi, this is Adam Ellenboss from Nightlight Astrology, and this is a daily video blog covering the upcoming eclipses for this month and next month. We have one at the very end of January and then one in February we're going to be looking at today. We're also going to be talking about the general meaning of eclipses. We're going to be talking about eclipse cycles. We're going to be talking about the nodes of the moon and different ways that traditional astrologers versus more modern astrologers have conceptualized the nodes as symbols within the language of astrology. So that's our goal for today. So eclipses get a lot of attention in astrology. Obviously, they're big celestial events that are somewhat rare. It's rare to see a total eclipse, especially a total solar eclipse. But they have provoked within the human spirit and imagination a diverse range of responses over thousands of years, right? They're very powerful omens and symbols in the sky. So they're important for astrologers. It's important to have a really nuanced understanding of the phenomenon of eclipses. Now, I try to say this at the beginning of every talk. This, like so many other topics in astrology, it can be a very vast subject. So today is not meant to be the final word or any kind of ultimate authoritative word, but just a contribution to the conversation. More than anything, what I really want my video blog and my work to do for the general public, whether it's my written horoscopes or my video blogs, is to educate people who are passionate about astrology, who pay attention to forecasts, about the language. Because this is the sky we're talking about. On some level, it's always going to require a deeper mystical commitment to become really adept at something like astrology or tarot or any form of divination. But we should also, like massive amounts of people, take in astrology all the time, and sometimes just trusting anything that's put out there without developing a little bit more of their intelligence and discrimination about the symbols, knowing some of their background and the different ways that they're treated and stuff like that, so that you can make a more informed decision about which astrologers to follow or which astrological advice to follow, or so that you can just know a little bit more about the language and become a better student yourself. Astrological education is always ongoing. So it's not as though by giving this talk, I assume that I've arrived at, I will likely change my mind about some of these things or become more informed about them in years to come. That's what keeps on happening, as we keep on studying astrology. All right, but let's start with very simple distinction. A solar eclipse and a lunar eclipse. Those are our two most basic forms of eclipses. We have one of each coming up in the next month. A month from today, roughly, we have a new moon solar eclipse in late Aquarius. And on January 31st of this month, we have a full moon lunar eclipse, which will be in the sign of Leo. So, big stuff coming. And when we enter into eclipse season, it's good to get a forecast for sure. So we're going to do that today. We're going to talk about forecasting these eclipses, what you can expect personally. We're also going to talk a little bit about educate people a little bit about eclipses and the nodes and eclipse cycles and things like that. A solar eclipse, all solar eclipses take place at the new moon. The simplest definition of a new moon in terms of a symbolic meaning is always something like a new beginning. So there are new beginnings that we experience all the time, right? You get up in the morning, it's a new beginning. You finish a 3-hour session of editing a paper for school, and you get up from your desk and you set it aside, it's a new beginning. You get done with the week and you hit the weekend, it's a new beginning. New beginnings, that we should have, like I say this a lot, we should have like a quarter jar for every time an astrologer says it's a new beginning. Because new beginnings are happening all the time. From a really esoteric standpoint, every single moment is arising and collapsing simultaneously into a kind of infinite presence. So new beginnings are, in some sense, the most redundant idea in astrology ever. The most redundant metaphor in astrology is death and rebirth ever, because every moment is death and rebirth. So we have to just we have to set that aside and then recognize there are different types of new beginnings. So once we know that there are different types of new beginnings, then we can start getting specific about what type of new beginning an eclipse might involve or a new moon might involve. What's the difference between them? Now that I tried to differentiate it so finely, I'm going to sound really generic and say you can think of solar eclipses, which are new moon eclipses. They always happen at the new moon. You can think of them like mega new moons. I know that sounds really simple. On the outside, it's like, okay, that's it. But every new moon symbolizes a kind of a new sort of karmic theme, a new karmic season, a new sequence of cause and effect events that are going to play out in life, a new mood, a new atmosphere. And you can almost always, to get a sense of where that's going, what that's going to look like specifically, the best way is to look at the sign that it's in and the ruling planet specifically, or to look at the whole sign house in your birth chart. If you use quadrant-based houses and look at where specifically by degree the new moon is landing. Okay, so for example, this new moon that's happening tomorrow in Capricorn is landing in my 9th whole sign house. So it's a new beginning in the 9th whole sign house. Well, on Friday, I'm leaving for India for several weeks, which is a foreign country. And the 9th house is the house that's related to long journeys and pilgrimages and foreign countries. So very, very simple. Look to the whole sign house in your chart, or look to the place Capricorn rules. You get a sense of what this new beginning entails. That's the most specific way that you can hone in on what type of new beginning or what area of your life will experience a kind of emphasizing a new little cycle. It's not a long cycle. It's a month long, right? And then the focus shifts. Focus in our life is always shifting subtly from theme to theme, and there's a different mood that comes in through every moon cycle. So, my 9th house is Capricorn. And so the 9th house theme for me is sort of Saturnine. Well, I have to look at Saturn in my chart to understand what that means. And, there's a complex way of you can analyze it in a more detailed fashion by studying it for tomorrow's eclipse, not only studying where Capricorn lands in your chart, but where Saturn is, and so forth. The mood of a new moon in a Saturn-ruled sign will be Saturnine, mature, serious, sober, maybe involving themes of the outcast or the outsider, what's marginalized or what's in the dark or ignorance, or, and then kind of psychological themes like seriousness, sobriety, maturity, focus, discipline, etc. So you can always break down a new moon like that. Now, when I say that a new moon solar eclipse is like a mega new moon, what I mean is that there's a deeper and I want to call it a more fated sense about the new moon, right? So you have this feeling of something very important and more powerful, more pivotal, more cathartic, more dynamic is occurring in that area of your chart. So, for example, let's say your new moon solar eclipse from last August that was in Leo, that total solar eclipse that everyone saw, it's sort of all the more important that you can actually see it everywhere, right? The visibility actually does matter on some level. But you look at Leo area of your chart, right? So I'll give you my example from my own chart again. I had the solar eclipse of Leo in my 4th whole sign house of home and family. So you would anticipate that in eclipses, they don't occur right away. The new beginning isn't like a normal new moon where the effects sort of play out over the next moon cycle. It's much broader than that. It's something that takes place between sets of eclipses, like big waves coming in sets. You have a whole season of a year and a half, sometimes about that long, where the nodes are traveling through one sign or two signs together, like Leo and Aquarius. They're creating eclipses in sets. The wave sets are coming through Aquarius and Leo. You could think about it like that. And so the wave set comes through your whole sign house of Leo, and then you anticipate that sometime before the next wave set comes in during Aquarius season, when the sun's moving through Aquarius, that the effects of that new beginning in your life are going to play out. Well, where was mine? 4th house, home and family. In November, found out that my wife was pregnant, right? So there's a new beginning in the house of home and family. 4th house, one of the houses commonly associated with things like family, marriage, home, property, etc. So very, very simple example in my own life. You can look at that and say, okay, so since August, there's been a big wave that came through. It's sort of like a mega new beginning, a new set of themes, a new mood, a new atmosphere emerging in the Leo portion of my chart. Thinking first about the topics of the house, and then you can think about the mood of the sign and vis-a-vis the planetary ruler. All right, so that's how you think about the new moon. Now, when you think about the full moon, full moon's always the lunar eclipses. Now, when you're looking at a full moon lunar eclipse, what you're looking at is a full moons always represent culmination. So they're the midpoint of the lunar cycle. So whatever seed is planted, so to speak, at the, we always use the metaphor of seeds, by the way, or the analogy. It's always like a plant cycle. And that's old. That's not just, it's not just creative modern astrologers who came up with that. The association between cycles and crops is, ancient. So we have the full moon representing the culmination, right? It's the moment when the cycle is becoming full and, in a sense, ripe. And it's from the ripe moment forward that the fruits of the cycle start to be harvested. So culmination, or the beginning of the end. You can think about the two interchangeably, the culmination or fullness of something, as well as the beginning of the harvesting portion of something. So the fruits start to get heavy and fall off the vine. And it's not just at the full moon that happens. It's the culmination and heaviness and ripening followed on the waning side of the cycle by the fruiting. So the sort of fruit falling off the vine. So full moon lunar eclipses represent mega full moons. They're enormous periods of culmination, followed usually by the sense of something fruiting, a karma that has come to fruition. Now, not all karma that comes to fruition is good, right? And the point is not to be attached to whether it's good or bad. That's always been talked about by mystics as a kind of trap. So but we can notice it, and it's important to, we observe all of these cycles so that we can flow with the Tao, so to speak, in a sensitive and in responsive, caring way, a mindful way. So at any rate, we're seeing this mega full moon. It's a culmination, and you can look for those culminations also specifically in the house where the full moon lands. So for example, we have an upcoming lunar eclipse on the 31st of this month in Aquarius. In Leo. The sun will be in Aquarius and the moon will be in Leo. So you're thinking about culmination, completion, something ripening within that area. For example, anything could happen, but I anticipate that it'll be by about the end of this month that I will know the gender or the sex of the child that my wife is carrying, right? So, and that's a simple example of a kind of a culmination within a process that's playing out. And remember, the eclipses will be coming through again for a while, right? So they're making like a full round, and the eclipse stories follow on one another. They track a story around your chart. So eclipse season will be coming around next summer when my wife is due, right? So it's you think about the metaphor of wave sets coming through. That's another thing that can really help. So look for culmination, completion, stuff like that. Now, so those are good ways of thinking about lunar and solar eclipses. Let's back up, though, and talk about, generally speaking, what does the moon represent and what does the sun represent in classical astrology. So in classical astrology, eclipses are important, different. It's not like there's just one unanimous way of looking at eclipses throughout history of astrology or anything like that, but there are some very generally accepted ideas about the sun and the moon that last for a very long time in the history of our craft. First of all, the moon, sun and moon, the two basic ingredients of eclipses, right? So we have to understand what they mean. The moon was said to rule the sublunary sphere. Now you have to kind of get into the ancient imagination of the cosmos, which was not fully informed about the actual physical nature of the cosmos, but that doesn't matter because as a spiritual metaphysical paradigm, that's what we should really be paying attention to. So the sublunary sphere is an idea within a sort of metaphysical model that ancient astrologers have that suggests that the planet that is closest to the material realm of Earth is the moon. Between the Earth and the moon are sort of the four elements, and then the Earth, which is a sort of this specific realm that's thought of as, this is the realm of the earthly realm is the realm of materiality, of karma, of fate, of fortune. and it's basically looked at as the realm of time and space, the realm that is defined by cycles of time repeating themselves endlessly, fluctuating through the opposites. This is the interaction of yin and yang in the material sphere. That sphere works according to laws that are repetitive and cyclical, and that's thought to be its primary nature. And human beings, insofar as we get identified with that world, will get caught up in cycling through its opposites endlessly, and that's thought to be ultimately very painful. So the first noble truth of most liberation traditions is recognize the nature of the opposites constantly fluctuating, the repetitive, enduring cycles of time, karma, fortune, fate, all similar names for the same idea, that this is the world that we're caught up in. Now, the spirit, or the soul, or consciousness, is thought of as, here within the material world, but belonging to a different sphere, a more spiritual plane. The planets are thought to be on higher planes in a sense than as metaphysical symbols. The planets are thought to be on higher spheres than this realm of the material karmic wheel of fortune that just keeps cycling. They're thought to be like administrators, sort of like karmic administrators of this realm. Their cycles represent or reflect in some way the unfolding of the laws of karma in time and space. The spirit or soul in the body is not thought to ultimately be born or to die. It can't be thought of in terms of the fluctuating of opposites that we see in the material world. And so most liberation traditions are based on cultivating some kinds of practices to facilitate liberation from identification with this world, either within this world or getting out of it entirely. There's different ways of looking at it, but that's the gist of it. The moon is the planet that is most intimately associated with the realm of karma, with the realm of fate, with the realm of the cycling of opposites, etc. Now, I think we have to throw out, ancient astrologers would have also associated this realm and the fluctuating and all of that stuff on some level with the feminine. They had genders related to it, which I think we need to throw out. It's better to think of it as yin and yang rather than getting into gender dynamics with this stuff, and that's just my opinion. But at any rate, this is the sublunary world. Now, the sun is a very complex symbol as well, but the sun, well, we'll go back up a second. So how does the moon come to be the ruler of that realm? We just arbitrarily assign it? No. The moon demonstrates that fluxional quality more than any other planet because it's the fastest planet. So it's moving faster than any other planet in the sky from our perspective, and it's fluctuating constantly its phases. So ebbing and flowing. It's reflective. So it's a reflective but not original light. What is the material world said to be, whether you're reading Plato's Republic or you're reading about the Tao or the yogis or the Buddhists? The material world is thought to be a kind of shadowy reflection of the eternal, or that thing which is beyond qualification or description, which sometimes is called consciousness or God. So at any rate, the moon is associated as a celestial object with that realm because it demonstrates flux, impermanence, variability, reflectiveness rather than the original. And also the moon is constantly changing its latitude relative to the ecliptic every month. So here you've got this ecliptic line in the sky that defines the sun's path. All of the other planets are located either below or above this center line of the sun, and they're traveling along it. That's the zodiac. The sun's path from our perspective defines the zodiac. So the moon is weaving up and down around that line constantly like a snake, just snaking its way up and down the central path of the sun. We see very similar themes in alchemical themes and yogic themes, where you see the energy of the kundalini spiraling around the central column of the spine. Similar ideas. They're all, in some sense, rooted in the observation of the heavens. The moon is therefore the symbol in the sky that's most fundamentally associated with the realm of fortune or karma, this material world, which is a kind of reflection of the eternal, but something that also, if we get identified with it, we get lost in it, and it's never-ending cycles, which don't give us what we're looking for, which is thought to be permanent happiness, the eternal happiness. So if you get lost in thinking, I just need pizza, I just need a slice of pizza, by God, I just need a toy, by God, I just need a little bit more sex or money or whatever, then round and round you'll go, because you'll get it, it'll suck to maintain it, or you'll lose it, and then you'll want it again, and round. Okay, so that's in a sense, that's the moon's realm. Now, that's not to degrade or diminish the moon at all, because in alchemy, the moon is also related to the, sometimes what's heard it referred to as the silvering of consciousness. So the moon as a kind of spiritual symbol has to do with remembrance, because the reflective light isn't just some kind of dull copy of an original, but the moon's reflective light is also a reference to that which is eternal, memorializing the eternal. So what do we do when we're chanting, our beads in a circle? 108 beads, right? For the thought to be a sacred number related to the distance between distance related to the moon. I'll just break it down simply not to get too complex. The remembrance of the mantra over and over and over, the remembrance of the eternal. That's also the moon. Psychology, all attempts to reflect on our attitudes, our behaviors, looking at something other than it being more than just a literal object, and reflecting upon it in order to, have that reflective connection back to consciousness. All of that is also the moon. So it's not to say that the moon is some kind of diminished symbol. Very important alchemical part of the process of enlightenment, you could say, in these different traditions. Now, okay, so that's the moon. Now, the sun, on the other hand, is thought to be more representative of that which is eternal. It's steady, it's constant, its face doesn't change, its path defines this great circle of the zodiac, the planets all orbit around it or in reference to it, above or below the ecliptic. Its latitude doesn't change, it's steady, etc. So the sun is thought to be the generative principle, the original light. So as a celestial object, the sun is thought to be more connected to the soul or the consciousness, that which is eternal. However, the sun can also play a role in connection to what we might call the everyday ego. It's not, the eternal light is not the only light that exists. People who are really ambitious and power hungry and seeking fame and mastery and authority in the world, oftentimes the sun in their chart will describe that more than anything spiritual, right? So the sun can also work as a symbol of something that we are fixated on, like an ideal or an idea, an image that we are willing ourselves toward in a more materialistic sense. In some ways, the sun in that regard is, no different than any other symbol in a chart. It doesn't, the sun does not inherently, like some astrologers out there, which I've heard over time, will say the sun in your chart really tells you, where to go for enlightenment. Now throw this out. It's overly simplistic. The main reason that that's an overly simplistic idea is because depending on if you were born at day or night, if the sun or the moon is the sect light of the chart, and what houses they're in, which planets they're afflicted by or helped by, etc., the sun or the moon can represent a path that is perhaps more likely to indicate someone cultivating their spiritual life. It's never as simple as the sun is spiritual and the moon is material. So the distinction is there, it's important, but it's also a flexible distinction that can be flip-flopped in interesting ways. That would take us down a whole rabbit hole conversation, something that I cover in my longer courses with my students, but we'll just leave it at that for now. The simple understanding, though, of the sun is that the sun is more related to, it's literally called the organ of the perception of the soul by Hellenistic astrologers. So it has a relationship to consciousness, whereas the moon has the relationship to body, karma, the material sphere, etc., all of which is still thought of as divine and eternal, but a reflective rather than original light, and one that is warned against in terms of getting lost in. Okay, so that gives us the sort of esoteric breakdown of the sun and the moon. Now let's talk about the nodes of the moon. What do the nodes of the moon represent? What are they? Some people know already, but a lot of people don't know, so let's talk about it. The nodes of the moon are essential for predicting and understanding eclipses. You have to understand what they mean to really sort of grok the meaning of eclipses. The nodes of the moon are thought of by Indian astrologers to be sort of shadowy planets. They're literally thought of like that, and I like that because they hold what I would consider to be the power of a demigod. They are actual. I really like how Indian astrologers conceptualize them. So they, North node is called Rahu in the Indian tradition, and the South node is called Ketu, and they're literally the head and the severed head and body of a demon. There's an asura. There's a whole story about it that's very fascinating. Now, but regardless, here's what they are. Every month, the moon is crisscrossing around, sort of weaving its way around the path of the sun in the sky. Now, as it crosses the sun's path, moving upward toward the north, coming back toward the pole star, in a sense, going up in the sky toward the northern. Ascending node, it was called, which is also what we call the north node, moving toward the north. When it snakes back, crossing through the same line, but heading downward toward the south in the sky, or descending in the sky, that's called the south node. It's when we have a new or full moon in close proximity to the nodes, one node in the case of a solar eclipse, or both nodes in the case of a lunar eclipse, because the sun and the moon are opposite at the full moon times. That's when we get our solar and lunar eclipses. That's when we have our eclipses. So the nodes of the moon are incredibly important. Why is there this karmic association with the nodes of the moon? Well, first and foremost, they're the nodes of the moon. So the first thing you have to understand is that the moon is related to karma. The moon is related to fortune, the wheel of fortune, fate, karma. They're all concepts that refer to this, the kind of law-bound material nature. Chemistry, biology, physics, this world, laws of this world. All right. So first of all, the nodes of the moon are relating then to cycles of karma, to cycles of fortune. As the moon crosses and ascends north, it's increasing, it's moving upward, and upward movement is associated with increase. Whereas downward movement, moving through the ecliptic going south, is associated with decrease. So traditionally, ancient astrologers associated the north node with the nature of Jupiter, increase, and the nature of the south node, as the moon is crossing going downward in the sky, with decrease, or Saturn. Okay, so that's the first thing you need to know. Then there's a very interesting sort of esoteric teaching that you find in different ancient astrology textbooks. One of them says this, and they're very similar all across the board. The north node increases both the good and the bad. The south node decreases both the good and the bad. So what does that mean? Well, in modern astrology, primarily one of the things you hear about the nodes is that the north node represents what you're supposed to do somehow, like the stuff that you're supposed to be working on. And the south node represents the stuff from your past, maybe the stuff that you've mastered already, that you're still attached to, that you're supposed to let go of. You're familiar with it, it's easy to stay attached to it. The north node is the brave new territory you're supposed to be cutting into, right? Now, I don't want to get into a big bashing of the modern take on the nodes, but I'll just say this, that I've studied as much as I can, and not that there's not more to study, but I've studied as much as I can of what ancient astrologers said about the nodes, both in the East and West, and there's nothing like this. So it's not to say chuck it out. There's always room for innovation and different uses of symbols, different esoteric understandings of symbols. But I'm really passionate about trying to just teach people the differences between these things, because I personally don't take the view that the North Node has something to do with what you're supposed to be working on, or that the South Node represents this sort of past stuckness or mastery or something like that. I do believe that they're karmic and that they have something to do with our karmic history, because they're the nodes of the moon, and the moon is the planet that's associated with our karma and our karmic history. So I agree that they're karmic. I don't agree with the take on the North and South that I just explained. Here's why. When an ancient astrologer says that the North Node increases both the good and the bad, remember that what they're talking about, first and foremost, is the realm of karma. And in the realm of karma, as long as you're identified with it, getting lost in it, all increase of any kind, good or bad, you got bad guys on the rise, you got good guys on the rise, it's always followed by decrease. Whether it's now or in another lifetime, the ebb and flow of the Tao, so to speak, the ebb and flow of the wheel of fortune is such that increase leads to decrease, and decrease leads back to increase. So first of all, the overall understanding of the nodes and the cycle of the nodes is not favorable for ancient astrologers. It's not. This is why, for example, in the Indian tradition, the nodes are largely looked at as malefics, because the entire cycle of karma that the nodes are related to is overall thought to be not such a great thing, especially, something to be careful of getting lost in. So you have to be sort of mindful of that. So that's for starters. But when the ancient astrologers say that the North Node increases both the good and the bad, what are they referring to? They're referring to the fact that you can think about it like Jupiter, right? Nobody has a problem saying that there are two types of Jupiter. There's the kind of inflation and excess and expansion and growth that is prolific and life-giving. It increases virtue and charity and faith and compassion and goodness in the world, and everybody celebrates that. But there's also the kind of inflation that leads to grandiosity, ego, arrogance, vanity, power, materialism, consumption, greed, etc. Jupiter, as a unanimous symbol of growth, is therefore related to the increase of both the good and the bad. So the North Node, in that sense, is being told very clearly, with especially whatever it's conjoined with. The nodes don't give light, so they don't make aspects to other planets. Another planet could make an aspect to them, but and especially the conjunctions matter, but they don't give light, so they're not making aspects. But the second thing is that the North Node in particular, is going to be associated with both the good and the bad that comes with increase. Let me give you a simple example. Sometimes people say something like this in a session. I've again seen so many clients over the years, and people will say, I really want this. I want this job. I want this house. I want this raise. I want this relationship. I want this kind of relationship with my kids. I want to be this kind of person. And insofar as they want it from a space of desire, they're not in the present moment. They're just not in the present, because in the present moment, we have everything that we need. I know that sounds like a cliche, but that's the practice. We may not feel that in every moment. That may not be like a lived reality. We may live every day with lack, but the practice, we may live every day with a feeling that we're lacking, but the practice is to come back to the present moment and say, I'm everything that I need. I have everything that I need. This is why these practices are centered on the breath, because the breath is the simplest reality of having what you need, right? So many of these practices emphasize breath because of that. So when people come in and they say even the most noble, beautiful, virtuous things, but they want them, I want that. That kind of gain, they could work really hard to get that, but that kind of gain will lead to the loss of exactly those things. Oh, I want to be the most virtuous, patient father in the world. And then you work really, really, really hard because you don't love yourself in the present moment. You get that thing, and then what happens eventually, you fall off the bandwagon. You commit a sin, you commit a fault, you chastise yourself, you beat yourself up. Everyone that you've built up to think you're so amazing, you've let down. They see you have an ego, you're a fraud, whatever. You see what I'm saying? The cycle of gain, whether it's virtuous gain or whether it's plain old I want money, It doesn't matter. In the material sphere, whatever you get, you lose. That's how the Tao fluctuates. Now, that doesn't mean you should say, well, it doesn't matter what I do or how I act. It's not to say that virtue doesn't matter. It's to say that we learn to act virtuously first and foremost by staying in the present, because it's from the present that the eternal spirit of generosity, of love, of compassion, that's the place where it really is. It's not in false images of it that we try to gain or get. And there's a big difference between the two. So first of all, the north node of the moon is associated with, in the realm of karma, with the temptation to want to gain something. And there's also, specifically with the north node, the temptation to believe that whatever we want to gain is really what's good for us. Really, 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 that's the good thing. And that's why I'm very suspicious and very, be careful with that modern astrological assumption that the north node is what's good for you, what you need to go and do, what you need to go and become, no, you don't need to go and become anything. That's my take, right? That's not to say that life and your soul's desires won't take you in the direction of a certain kind of appetite or hunger. It will. And you'll follow your appetites and hungers, and they will become your greatest teachers, of course. But there's a big difference between saying that the north node is representative of those things that you need to go and do, that you have to become, that you need to work on, and saying, no, the north node represents the desires of the soul, which are going to keep perpetuating reincarnation, right? And as they keep perpetuating reincarnation, the north node will do so through tempting you into what you're hungry for. So look at the north node in your chart. Just try it on for size. You don't have to if you don't like my take on the nodes, that's fine. Obviously, the modern take is different, and I think that there's room for different takes on these things. I don't want to start a authoritarian regiment on the nodes. But try it on for size. Look at the north node in your chart, and rather than seeing it as indicative of what you need to do, think of it as indicative of what the soul is hungry for, that is taking you out of the present moment and eventually is going to perpetuate reincarnations. Don't place who cares? Reincarnations are pretty common. According to these traditions, if you reincarnate, that's, it takes a lot, like the process of what the spirit or soul is doing here doesn't have a time limit on it, right? So there's no need to be spiritually ambitious about not reincarnating either, right? It's another really important distinction. But look at the north node, and rather than thinking about it as, okay, this is something that I have to go and get, it's because it's like a lesson that I need to learn or something like that. Think about it as the appetite or hunger or desire that you have that will tempt you into an illusion of progress. Okay, just play with it that way and see what you find. Now, what about the south node? So the south node is related to decrease, and it's said to decrease both the good and the bad. So the other end of the karmic cycle is not just gain, but loss, decline, disintegration, death. Well, for Indian astrologers, the north node was inauspicious, considered like a hungry ghost, right? Really not a great shadowy planet in their view to be working with. Rahu is sort of nasty. Rahu is, I want this, I want that, I want this, I want that. And a lot of the times you think it's saintly what you want, right? But one thing that's really helped me check my own, desires for things has been daily meditation. When I meditate every day, and I really don't slack up on that practice, what I start to notice is that anything and everything that I want is on some level pretty absurd. That's not to say that you have to take up some kind of like ironclad, authoritarian attitude against yourself and your desires. That would also be absurd. But there's something, when you meditate every day, you start realizing all the things that you think you want, images of yourself as this or that, images of yourself as Thich Nhat Hanh, or images of yourself as the leading CEO of consciousness, or whatever, all these different dreams that we have. All of it, when you really stay with your breath, even as just a little practice. I'm not a world-class meditator, right? I'm an amateur meditating in my living room every day, though, but I make it every day. And that has benefited me, and I would say could benefit anyone, and just make you a little bit more aware of that glamorous illusion of saying that that you're here because there's something to do or something to work on or something to become. I think we have to be very careful of that. So I really am on board with the Indian idea that Rahu is a sort of dangerous, like, be careful, because Rahu, the north node, really tempts you to think that you have to move towards something. Now, Ketu, or the south node, in the unanimous statement about south node being related to loss or decline, the good and the bad, you have the south node decreases both the good and the bad. Well, in this world, we experience loss. That's another part of the cycle of karma. Whatever we get, we eventually lose. So when we lose something, there is a temptation to get depressed, right? And then from within that depression builds the desire for something new. So you can see the head and the tail of the dragons, it's eating its own tail, it's cycling endlessly, all metaphors and images associated with the moon and the moon's nodes. And the south node, we lose something in the material world. It's connected to loss. So loss is painful. Nobody likes loss, and there's no need to minimize it. Like, loss hurts. We don't have to be superhuman. We can grieve, we can mourn, and it's also natural to, like, just as natural as it is that we're not going to change our nature instantly. Like, I'm going to want a piece of pizza after this talk. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not above that. I'm not above being sad if my dog dies, right? I had a dog that died a year or two ago, and God, it was devastating, right? So it's not, there's no like, we're not telling people to, like, bypass being a human being, but we have to be very careful, because the cycles of gain and loss, if we don't have a healthy reflective distance from them, we get lost in them. That's the main idea. So with loss, we're tempted to get stuck into a feeling of need again. From deprivation grows a new hunger, and then we go toward something else again, and round. Well, but the other thing that loss does, and this is why Indian astrologers said that the south node, for all of the pain it could generate in the material world, was thought to be more auspicious than Rahu, the north node. And the main reason for this is that material loss leads to an opening for spiritual gain. Now, this is kind of a perennial truth that the Buddha talks about, that many great mystics from different traditions have talked about. Jesus says it is more difficult for how does he say it? It's more difficult for a rich man to get into heaven than it is for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. You have a lot of stuff in the material world, it's harder to cling to spirit, because that stuff clouds and sheaths the consciousness. But when you lose things, when there's loss, a doorway opens to be connected to that which is eternal, because you see through, especially in times of loss, you see how temporary things are. So the south node, especially in the Indian tradition, is associated more auspiciously with the cultivation of spiritual life, specifically because it's associated with material decline, loss, death, and disintegration. So that changes the views of the nodes again significantly, because a lot of the times in modern astrology, people say, well, the nodes, the south node is what you're familiar with, what you've already mastered, etc. No, it doesn't appear to be that way in the tradition. What the tradition really tells us is that, no, the south node is associated with loss, with pain, and yes, with letting go, but the virtue of the south node persists in this lifetime. When you have south node activity in your chart, you're usually going to have loss, but in studying the charts, again, of many, many, many people over the years and looking at different views of the nodes, I found that south node periods, again, are much more sort of auspicious for people to cultivate spiritual life. The north node, again and again, tends to tempt people back into the traps of their ego, even spiritual traps, meaning even things that are pretty selfish that are dressed up in spiritual language or spiritual images, like being a good person or doing the right thing or saving the day or developing into your highest self or whatever. It more and more and more, there is a kind of hungry ghost that I see with the north node, whereas there's loss and pain and grief in the material world with the south, but a beautiful way that the soul tends to wake up to itself and cling to sort of cling closer to spirit through South Node experiences. Now, take that or leave that. I wanted at least to introduce everybody to the differences in terms of the meanings of the nodes, so that you are aware that there are different perspectives. That's it. So now that you have some view of the nodes and what they're traditionally related to, back to eclipses. So when you have a major new beginning in an eclipse, and you have a major culmination during eclipse season, solar or lunar eclipses we talked about at the beginning of this talk, now you can reconceptualize it. If you take up the view that I took, you don't have to. If you still like the more modern evolutionary view, that's totally fine. They're both, again, in my view, I see good people doing good work with both of these things. And let me just qualify everything that I said about the North Node by also saying that whatever you're hungry for in life, right? Whatever your ego or your soul like desires or craves that isn't spirit, that is not God, that's not the source or consciousness from within this tradition, there's no reason to say that cannot become your teacher, right? So let's just use myself as an example. I have the North Node in my 4th house of home and family, right? Getting married, starting a family, having kids, these were really idyllic, all-American ideas that I had in my head, right? That I wanted, that I desired. And in part, a lot of what I started learning in evolutionary astrology told me that's what you need to do. That's what you need to cultivate. It's what you're not good at yet, right? Okay. Now, I don't go down that path. What I've experienced since starting a family is that I had no idea exactly what I was getting into. The things that I craved and was hungry for in these experiences are indeed going to perpetuate more karma, they take maintenance. Family life takes a lot of maintenance, and it takes you away from spiritual life unless you're able to recognize the ego that was present in that desire and then say, okay, well, if my soul desired this and this was the path that I went down, then I have to practice the mindfulness of attending to the dharma of my soul. The duty, in other words, of the soul it doesn't matter if you have an appetite for something that's not spiritual, there's no reason it can't be spiritualized. So it's not to take an ultra negative view of the North Node. And in some ways, what I'm saying right now loops back into a more positive understanding of the North Node. You're going to be hungry for stuff as a soul. That's why you're here. You have karma. We're all going to perpetuate that karma with further desires. I do believe that the North Node tells us what we're hungry for. I think we have to be very careful to assume that being hungry for anything but the divine is healthy. That's my own belief. But that doesn't mean that you can't reorient the hungers in your life that you've chosen back to the divine through the loving and mindful attention to dharma, meaning your desires that you choose, like a family, marriage, etc., you show up and you do it with all of your heart and you give it to God, every single thing that you're doing. And then that becomes the spiritualization of the North Node's thing. That's very different than saying, see, if I were just hands down to say, yes, you're supposed to get a family and wife and buy property and all this 4th house stuff, then I would never learn what the Indian astrologers have taught and what the ancient astrologers taught about the beware of the spirit of desire, right? Because those are things that I desired out of a place of ignorance. And coming into them, I realized that I was ignorant. That doesn't mean I don't love my wife or my kids, but that's the reality of how desire in the world works. Most of the time, once we realize and taste the fruit of our desire, blah, no good, right? So, but then we've signed up to keep eating a whole piece of fruit. So the only way to eat that piece of fruit and not have it be blah is for it to be a mindful thing that we're dedicating to the divine. And then it becomes spiritualized, then it becomes sanctified. That's the entire symbolism in the Christian tradition of God becoming man and being killed. Like, that's the whole message of sanctification. So don't get me wrong on saying that the North Node is somehow entirely negative. All right, anyway, that's a segue. So we have lunar eclipses and solar eclipses representing major new beginnings, new endings, and so forth. Now, going forward, we have a couple of things to talk about now in terms of how to understand and translate all of this in terms of the upcoming eclipses. We have a new moon in late Cap tomorrow with 6 planets in Capricorn. So first of all, that's a big lineup. So spend some time looking at the planets in Capricorn in your birth chart. Look at the house that Capricorn rules by whole sign, or look at where the late degrees of Capricorn are in your birth chart. That's the area that's going to be lit up with the next new moon. Reason that that's important is because the new moon is going to, even though it's not an eclipse tomorrow, it's opening our eclipse season. The January 31st full moon is going to be a lunar eclipse. So you got a major period of culmination. It's in late Aquarius. So that's where the karma is really fruiting, late Aquarius. Now this degree is going to be almost exactly opposite the Leo eclipse from last August. So you can also think about houses in your chart in terms of binaries. For example, in my chart, the Leo Aquarius nodes are in my 10th house Aquarius and 4th house Leo. In this sense, the 4th house eclipse Leo was that was the solar eclipse from last August. You know, my wife is pregnant. That, you know, this is my north node area, right? So couldn't help myself. And I'm going to, and this I see it as, this is what's here to be sanctified. This is the path of my love. That's where my dharma is. So that's what I'm going to do. But the lesson deepens. And then the south node lunar eclipse will be, the new moon, the new moon solar eclipse, in Aquarius, that's going to be next month in February, will be in the opposite house, in the 10th. So the 4th house, home and family, the 10th, career. Every set of houses in astrology works like that through the language of opposite topics or themes in our life. So you can think of the coming eclipses as also emphasizing the tension between 2 areas of your life. If it was the 1st and the 7th, you might think about myself and others or people I'm in relationship with. The 2nd and 8th, let's say my money, my resources, someone else's, or shared resources, just simple stuff. The 3rd might be something about your own mind, your own communication. You know, in the 9th house might be something about higher doctrines or teachings that you believe in. The 4th is home. The 10th is public life. The 5th is, let's say, private recreation, joy, and creativity. The 11th is more, ambitious activities that you're up to try and advance your ambitions in the world. This is more classical standpoint. 6th is misfortune. The 12th is loss. You have different kinds. That gets a little bit more complicated when you go into the traditional house meanings. But at any rate, think of the opposite meanings of the houses during these eclipses. You've got, on the 31st of this month, the full moon lunar eclipse is in Leo. So there's a culmination happening in the Leo area of your chart. Think about that. Then you have the new moon lunar eclipse in late Aquarius opposite the Leo eclipse from last August. That's going to be in the contrary or opposite house that the Leo eclipse was in from August. So you can think of, again, big fruiting and karmic development overall in those areas of your life. That's the easiest way to think about it. Now, I want to try to make this talk, my target was an hour, so I'm going to move on unless anybody has any questions about all of this. How is a householder life not divine? It's not, again, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. It's not that householder life is not divine, right? It's about every soul having desires, right? And a desire could be for anything, right? A desire could be to have the all-American family. A desire could be to have a kick-ass career. A desire could be to be a really spiritually masterful person, to have a kick-ass love life, to have a lot of money. People have all, the soul has all different kinds of desires. The important thing is to recognize that the North Node was traditionally associated with desire. The main thing that these mystical traditions, especially in the East, believed is that the one desire that you really want to cultivate is the desire for devotional union with the divine. That can be found in and through anything in the world, right? Like the world is not evil, but the main thing is to understand that your desire for the all-American family has to be replaced by the desire for God. And when you have that reorientation of your values, then you can sanctify your desire for a householder life, because it's being channeled through your primary desire, which is for God. Now, you may not agree with that at all. Like, people could totally choose to disagree with me about that, which is fine, but that's how we have to shift. The North Node's general meaning is not you may sanctify along the path of the North Node, but that's not a guarantee that you will. More fundamentally, the North Node is about what you desire. That's how I understand it. That's how I understand ancient astrologers to have understood it. So I very much feel like, that householder life, for me, I didn't know what I was getting into. I recognized the hunger that I had for it, that was something that was a separative desire. That as I now more and more as I age and my spiritual path deepens, as I reorient all of my desires toward the divine, then sure, this path is sanctified. And I love it because I love God first. And it's a big difference, right? Because people get lost in their desires. So hopefully that makes some sense. Anyway, okay, so last time that the nodes were in Aquarius, this is really important. Nodal cycles go through about a 19-year period where they repeat. Last time the nodes were in Aquarius and Leo, but reversed. Right now, for example, you have the North Node in Leo and the South Node in Aquarius. Last time that they were in these signs but reversed, meaning the North Node was in Aquarius and the South Node was in Leo, was about 9 years ago, between January 2008 to roughly July of 2009. So you can look back at that time in your life, and you can look at similar sort of patterns that are playing out in the Aquarius and Leo areas of your chart. This is where studying eclipses, it really helps to know your birth chart. For me, it's the ultimate frame of reference for understanding these. The last time that the nodes were in Aquarius and Leo in the same way that they are now was 18 years ago, which takes you all the way back from roughly September of 98 to April of 2000. So I'll repeat those. The last two times that we've had the karmic cycles recurring in these places, January 2008 to July 2009. Then before that, September 98 to April 2000. Let me give you a quick example of how that's worked in my own life so that you can play with it. Okay, so remember, Aquarius is my 10th house, Leo is my 4th in whole sign houses. So in 1998, when we were in our eclipse cycle between those two signs, when this all started, and remember, this is my home nodal signs. North Node is in my 4th house natally, and South Node is in my 10th house in Aquarius natally. So this is a full karmic cycle for me. In September of 1998, I dropped out of high school and started attending a community college as what's called a post-secondary student in Minnesota. I was, this is happening, and at that time, I also sort of moved into the basement of my house and started dissociating myself from my family. So you've got the 4th house and the 10th house. My future career, I started studying philosophy. I was antisocial. I was dropping out of school. I was dropping out of church. I was separating myself from my family and what they were up to. This is 10th house, 4th house stuff, starting a new cycle. So I'm going to community college. I'm living in the basement. I'm not speaking, dissociating from my family, and I'm studying nothing but philosophy. So the 10th house, 4th house really activated at the start of a new karmic cycle. Now, January 2008 to July of 2009, I'm finally finishing all of college and 2 graduate degrees back to back that got started in 98. So between January 2008 and July 2009, I have now, from that whole time period, what's happened is I've finished 2 graduate degrees, and at the end of that period, I'm publishing a book that I started writing. It's a memoir, a coming-of-age memoir, that the timeline starts at the time when I'm going, basically dissociating from my family. And my father's a minister and everything that was happening in the church. And so the timeline of a memoir also started that I wrote that kickstarted my career, and it was all about my family. So between 98 and 2000, I'm leaving for college early and sort of dissociating from my family. That becomes the start of a timeline of a memoir that I'm finishing up after 2 graduate degrees and nothing but school since that period in 2008 to 2009. And then I then moved to New York and the book was published, and it launches my career basically as an astrologer through an interesting turn of events. And during that whole cycle, I'm also drinking a lot of ayahuasca and other stuff. So now that that's coming full cycle, right? It's coming all the way back around. It's starting a brand new cycle, right? So that's what's going on in my life right now. So you can track these if you go back. Now mine are pretty big because it's sort of exemplary because I happen to also have the nodes in Aquarius and Leo when I'm born, where they are right now in the sky. So it's a full nodal return for me. But needless to say, if I'm very carefully studying that cycle is about karma. The things that led that cycle are, for example, when I was a kid, I desired to be a famous writer. Thankfully there have been things along the way that have helped to spiritualize that process, reorient my desires toward the divine, not perfectly or anything, right? But that's part of the path. Since I was that age, I had an idyllic, total, relentless hunger for wife and family and home and kids, as it was going to be a salvation from the fact that my family was falling apart when I was a kid. So these have been my soul's pains and desires, and they've led me down a karmic path. It's very important to again, the main thing would be within that path, whatever the nodes are outlining, whatever karmic dimensions they're bringing up in your life, to recognize that the story being told is one of what the soul desires in response to the cycles of the world that it tends to get lost in. And how can we sanctify those desires? How can we make them holy? How can we make them sacred? By reorienting our desires back to the divine. However that looks for each person, it's a little different. I'm not suggesting you have to join a cult or a religion, but for me, the simplest practice that most people can get into is mindfulness. So that to me is the way of reorienting the aim of our desire back to the divine. So I hope that this has been interesting. Again, go back to 2008, 2009, and 98 to 2000 to look at the last times that Leo Aquarius nodal stories were playing out. I hope that this was interesting for everybody, that it brought up new ways of thinking about the nodes and eclipses. I hope that you all have a very blessed eclipse season. My encouragement for everyone is, love your life, love whatever you've signed up for, and also try to recognize the cycles that our desires lead us into, and how can we start orienting ourselves to true spiritual wealth and happiness? How can we start orienting our desires back to that? And usually that kind of desire is so much simpler, so much more basic, so humble, really. So anyway, thank you guys. I hope you guys have a beautiful eclipse season. Take care. Bye, everyone.